Our relationships change the course of our lives, but can they change history? I'm the Affair Archivist, and this month's affair to remember is that between George and Imogene Remus. On Easter Sunday 1930, a strange discovery was made in Eden Park. On that mild spring day in Cincinnati, an Easter egg hunt was underway. As children scoured the bushes and the fields for their treats, one boy came upon something more than a pastel egg. A rusty pistol with a pearl-encrusted handle. The lost weapon was odd for several reasons, and its ornate handle doesn't even begin to tell the tale. It was a relic of the Jazz Age. It symbolized the violence and the excess of a then bygone era. It was also a murder weapon, one that brought about its owner's demise. Her name was Imogene Remus, and her husband George was once the king of the bootleggers. George Remus is a singular man in American history. He was the most prolific bootlegger of Prohibition. It is possible he may have served as inspiration for Jay Gatsby. He had a quirk in which he referred to himself in the third person, and he murdered his mistress-turned-wife. His titanic rise and fall is really one for the books. George Remus was born in Germany in 1876 and immigrated to America in 1882. He would never become an American citizen, a fact that would be later used against him. The Remus family struggled to make their way in the United States and lived in poverty. His father used drinking to cope and soon became angry and violent. As an adult, Remus would become a lifelong teetotaler, which is pretty ironic. In 1890, at the age of 14, Remus quit school and began working at his uncle's drugstore as a pharmacist's assistant to help support the family. By this time, they had settled in Chicago. 5 years later, he became a licensed pharmacist. He lied about his age in order to obtain this credential. His uncle helped him buy his own drugstore. Remus was a snake oil salesman and sold tonics and elixirs that contained mercury and other toxins. Remus peddled his toxic potions and named them after himself. Some of his products included Remus's Nerve Tonic and Remus's Liver Pills. He also urged his customers to call him Dr. Remus, despite having no medical training. Even at this early stage in his career, Remus was already thinking about his brand and marketing himself. In the summer of 1899, Remus married Lillian Krause, a piano teacher. 9 months later, the couple's only child, Romola Remus, was born. Fun fact, in 1910, Romola starred as Dorothy in the first film adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. L. Frank Baum handpicked her for the role. By 1904, Remus was bored of being a pharmacist and decided to pursue a career in law. He may not have known it then, but he was developing a skill set that would make him uniquely qualified to be a bootlegger and to eventually defend himself in his own murder trial. Maybe changing careers isn't such a bad thing after all. As a young lawyer, Remus was mentored by the illustrious Clarence Darrow, who was the most famous lawyer of his time and best remembered for the Scopes monkey trial. Remus soon gained a reputation as a formidable defense attorney in Chicago. He specialized in defending men who murdered their wives, which in hindsight seems like foreshadowing. He was especially passionate about defending those who faced the death penalty and was known for his theatrical speeches and over-the-top tactics. His style soon earned him the first of many nicknames, the Weeping, Pleading Remus. Famously, Remus defended one of his clients who was accused of poisoning his wife by poisoning himself in front of the entire courtroom. Everyone was astounded when Remus didn't drop dead on the spot after ingesting a vial of poison. But he used his training as a pharmacist and consumed an antidote beforehand. His client was acquitted. Talk about transferable skills. In 1915, Lillian Remus filed for divorce from George on the basis of cruelty. She stated that Remus was physically and verbally abusive and that he carried on affairs with other women. She also felt Remus did not provide enough money for her and her daughter to survive, even though his law practice was making bank. He was an absentee husband and father, living in hotels instead of at home with his family. When he did make visits to see his wife, they usually ended in heated arguments. However, the weeping, pleading Remus begged her to take him back and promised to increase Lillian's allowance. Not because he loved her and wanted to make their marriage work. He was worried about the damage a divorce would have on a successful law firm. Lillian relented, at least for the time being. Remus met his second wife through his law practice. Augusta Imogene Remus was born in Milwaukee in 1884. Imogene married Albert Holmes in 1904 and gave birth to a daughter named Ruth in 1907. Her husband was a grain merchant and provided a stable and steady income for the young family. However, Imogene had bigger and grander things in mind. She fancied herself as something of an aristocratic society woman stuck in a middle-class, boring life in the ho-hum city of Milwaukee. This was too provincial for Imogene. She craved more excitement, more adventure, and more money. One could refer to the future Mrs. Remus as a piece of work. She lied about her age to Remus, purporting herself to be 5 years younger than she actually was. Interestingly, her Find a Grave page lists her birth date as 1888, so to this day the lie about her age has stuck. She was exuberant, flirtatious, vivacious. She loved to show off her curves in hip-hugging frocks and beguiled men with her dark eyes and dark curls. She also craved the spotlight and went to great lengths to put herself in it. Remus and Imogene met while Imogene was employed as a dust girl cleaning his office. To cover up her humble beginnings, Imogene invented a meet-cute story for herself and her future husband. She claimed that their paths crossed when she was working behind the counter of a deli and Remus was a regular. As time went on, they began flirting and holding hands, and eventually started dating and fell in love. In actuality, as she worked as his dust girl, the pair bonded over their failing marriages. Remus would take on Imogene's divorce case pro bono, and the two would eventually begin an affair. As we will later learn, it's a really bad idea to date your divorce attorney. Nonetheless, it's easy to see how they connected. Remus and Imogene were both flamboyant personalities with a taste for luxury, a craving for attention, and a fraught relationship with the truth. Each of them saw an opportunity in the other. Remus saw Imogene as a project, a down-on-her-luck gal that he could pluck out of the gutter and transform into a refined society lady. Imogene, well, she saw Remus as money. In 1916, Imogene planted an article in the Philadelphia Enquirer about her husband, Albert Holmes. The article told the story of her husband's abandonment of his wife and children for another woman. The article also mentioned how Holmes had spent all of his money wooing his new lover with extravagant gifts, and that his children had only one pair of shoes. As we know, Imogene was the mother of only one child, who I'm guessing had more than one pair of shoes. Imogene enjoyed getting attention by making up fake news stories and having them published. Apparently, these articles on domestic dirty laundry were common in newspapers of the era, and Imogene planned to use her 5 seconds of fame against her husband in the divorce proceedings. Imogene craved a different sort of life, with the type of luxury her husband's imaginary mistress enjoyed, and she'd soon achieve it. Remus put Imogene up in her own luxury apartment and showered her with the types of gifts and lifestyle she felt was her birthright. But that wasn't enough for Imogene. She wanted to make things official. Imogene's own divorce was finalized by 1917. However, we already know that Remus was resistant to the idea of divorce out of fear of the negative impact it would have on his business. So he tried to have his cake and eat it too, which worked for about 2 years as he lived a double life between Lillian and Imogene. But Imogene, ever the grifter, would eventually find a way to force his hand. In February of 1919, an ad appeared in the paper about a missing watch. A plumber named Hubert Youngs found the watch and returned it to the address listed in the paper. When Youngs arrived to return the watch, Imogene answered the door. He claimed that she refused to pay him the reward money. Imogene countered that she gave Youngs the money, yet he refused to leave. Remus, who Imogene claimed was visiting friends upstairs, heard the argument down below and came down to his damsel in distress's rescue. He beat Youngs to a pulp. Remus was charged with assault for beating the man. At the trial, Remus passionately defended himself. I acted in self-defense, as any red-blooded man with a spark of chivalry would have acted. This ruffian of a plumber was disturbing a lady. He was roughhousing, loudmouthed, irrelevant, and immaterial about the premises, and I only forcibly applied a perfectly good and legal writ of ejectment. Imogene also testified and electrified the courtroom. Spectators later remarked that they wished the lighting in the courtroom was better so they could get a better look at her. Imogene lapped up the attention. Remus was acquitted of the crime, and Imogene left the courtroom with an increased appetite for publicity. The unintended, or intended, consequences of this ordeal would result in the end of Remus's first marriage. Lillian Remus read of the incident in the paper, put 2 and 2 together that George and Imogene were lovers, and filed for divorce for the second and final time on the basis of intolerable cruelty. Lillian told reporters that Imogene could have Remus. Smart lady. Imogene defended her man in the press. "He's a perfect gentleman. The trouble with modern wives is this: they don't know how to treat their husbands. A husband should be given all the rope he wants. He will never hang himself." As a counterattack, Lillian claimed that Imogene was essentially stalking Remus, and though he had tried to end their affair on numerous occasions, Imogene followed him day and night, armed with a gun, resolute that they were meant to be. The divorce was finalized in March of 1919. Remus would pay a hefty settlement and alimony to his ex-wife. Imogene was thrilled that Remus was finally free to marry her. Not because she was crazy in love, oh no. A man who sold her a washing machine claimed that she revealed her true motivations in being with Remus to him. "I'll get his dough even if I have to marry him, although I don't want to. I'm going to nick him. I've got the big boob right where I want him." Interesting tidbits to share with your washing machine salesman. But okay, Imogene, you do you. In October of 1919, the unthinkable happened. Congress passed the Volstead Act, making alcohol illegal in the United States of America. The law went into effect on January 16, 1920. The Volstead Act would change the lives of countless Americans, but the impact would be especially significant for George Remus. His training as a lawyer and a pharmacist gave him the specialized skills he needed to exploit the new law of the land. Remus started Prohibition defending bootleggers, but then realized he could make a lot more money on the other side of the law. He got started forging whiskey certificates. He also used his pharmaceutical background to obtain legal whiskey. It was still permitted for medical purposes, and used to treat several ailments at the time. Remus closed his law practice, sold off all of his assets, and moved to Cincinnati with Imogene. Remus knew this was the perfect location to run booze. Just off the Canadian border and close to the Ohio River, with easy access to Kentucky, the whiskey capital of America. Shortly after the move, he and Imogene were married in June of 1920. To further expand his bootlegging business, Remus bought shares in several distilleries in Kentucky and the Midwest. He bought a farm, known as Death Valley, to be used as a distribution center for the alcohol. He also purchased several pharmacies and used them as a front to peddle alcohol on the black market. Remus adopted Imogene's daughter Ruth around this time. Within a year of being in business, Remus owned between 25 and 30% of all of the alcohol in the country. But this immense power would also bring him into full focus of the feds. In 1920, Prohibition agents were tipped off about the existence of the Death Valley distribution operation. In October of that year, Remus was informed that a raid of the property was imminent. He planned to go there with some of his associates to grab some of the whiskey before the Prohies got to it. However, Imogene pleaded with him not to go. "Don't go, Daddy, don't go! You'll be killed! Then what will I do?" So, Remus didn't go. When the cops came to their doorstep, Imogene lied and said that Remus wasn't there. She also had her new pearl-handled pistol nearby, a gift from her husband. The Prohies eventually found Remus, arrested him, and charged him with 3,000 violations of the Volstead Act. He may have been a good lawyer, but he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of this one, especially if Mabel Walker Willebrandt, Attorney General, had anything to do with it. George and Imogene didn't let his arrest and impending trial get them down. They just purchased a new mansion in the elite Price Hill neighborhood of Cincinnati. The deed was in Imogene's name, a wedding gift from George. They renovated their mansion for $750,000, a sum equivalent to about $14 million today. Their mansion was gaudy and outfitted with all the luxuries one could possibly imagine. Oriental rugs worth $150,000, paintings purchased from an Italian duke, collectibles including George Washington and Abe Lincoln's signatures, and a lock of Benedict Arnold's hair. Certainly George and Imogene's approach to interior design was an acquired taste. 1922 was approaching, and George and Imogene invited all of Cincinnati's movers and shakers to a New Year's Eve party to show off their new home. The Remus' New Year's Eve party would go down in history. The newspapers dubbed it a Roman orgy. It was a party that would have made Jay Gatsby look like a pauper. In fact, it may have inspired the creation of American literature's most enduring character. All of Cincinnati's high rollers were invited, but only a few of them came, and they were content to drink Remus's liquor. But when it came to socializing with the flamboyant immigrant and his uncouth wife, they drew a line. Furthermore, the Remus' gaudy tastes offended their old money sensibilities. Their children even bullied and isolated Ruth because of her stepfather. Nonetheless, about 500 people attended the party. They just weren't the tastemakers of high society that Remus hoped to attract. Ever the showman, Remus lit his guests' cigars with $100 bills, hid $1,000 bills under each guest's plate, and gifted each male in attendance gold watches and diamond stick pins. Just when they thought they were left out, all of the female partygoers were ushered outside by Remus and introduced to their new 1922 sedans. That's right, Remus was giving away cars long before Oprah. The climax of the party came at midnight, when partygoers followed George and Imogene to their indoor heated swimming pool called the Imogene Baths. The swimming pool was made of marble, designed with Greco-Roman architecture, and cost $175,000, approximately $3 million in today's money. Imogene was the first to dive into the pool, nearly spilling out of her revealing swimsuit. Her guests looked on, sipping champagne from gold-rimmed glasses. Swimmers dressed as nymphs followed her and did a synchronized swimming routine. Women dressed in Grecian robes served the New Year's Eve feast. It was the high point of the Remus' marriage. The party was a huge success, but 1922 would mark the end of the couple's honeymoon period and the beginning of Remus' downfall. Despite his blowout party, Remus was still in hot water for the Death Valley raid. His trial began in May of 1922, and Remus was confident that his bribes to Jess Smith, a member of President Harding's corrupt Ohio gang, would result in a not guilty verdict. However, his money couldn't save him. He was found guilty of violating the Volstead Act and sentenced to 2 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. At the same time, things began to steadily unravel between Remus and Imogene. In the summer of 1922, after his trial and conviction, Remus, Imogene, and Ruth left for a road trip to Chicago. The couple got into a fight on the way, and Remus left the mother and daughter on the side of the road. He eventually came back and picked them up, but that wasn't the end of the trouble. Ruth would later testify that Remus threw a box of candy at Imogene and insisted that she turn over the deed of the house to him. When she refused, he bloodied her nose. In October, Remus's violence escalated. When he returned from a business trip to Kentucky and Imogene was not present at their mansion, he flew into a rage. One of the servants informed George that Imogene and a friend traveled to Indianapolis for the day with a rug salesman named Nicholas Shamas. Remus was outraged that Imogene was with Shamas because he had demanded that she not associate with him, convinced that he was a con man. Remus got back in the car and headed to the Claypool Hotel in Indianapolis to confront Shamas. He didn't just confront him, though. He beat him over the head with his cane, which was weighted with lead. Remus was charged with assault and battery with the intent to kill. However, when the trial came up several months later, the charges were dropped. It seemed that Shamas had disappeared into thin air. Around this time, Imogene said, "I'm afraid of this man. I'm afraid he's going to kill me. He is so insanely jealous." All of the appeals and bribes for his convictions for bootlegging failed, and Remus was ordered to begin serving his time in Atlanta in January of 1924. Before reporting to prison, Remus gave Imogene power of attorney and control of his distillery in Cincinnati, several bank accounts, $1 million worth of whiskey certificates, his jewelry, and basically everything he owned. Most significantly, he gave her his diamond stick pin from the New Year's Eve party, a token of their love and life together, which they would resume as soon as he was released. He would later come to regret this decision. When Remus finally did go to jail, he lived pretty much the 1920s equivalent of the jail scene in Goodfellas. He spent $425 decorating his cell, got himself a new mattress, fancy blankets and sheets, his own refrigerator, private bath, a cushy job at the library, and he ate all of his meals alone. He even bribed prison guards to let Imogene come into his cell and cook and clean for him. Imogene split her time between Cincinnati and Atlanta, living in a hotel in the latter city to be close to George. As she cleaned his cell, she would call him Daddy loud enough for the other prisoners to hear. Remus would later say she liked to show off. They say absence makes the heart grow fonder, but George still treated Imogene like garbage during his prison stint. He'd often fly into rages and verbally abuse Imogene at the drop of a hat, or blow off her visits to go play baseball. Imogene's sister called him and asked, "Why does Imogene cry after she sees you?" He replied, "Because she doesn't understand me." Each time Remus had an outburst of verbal or physical abuse towards Imogene, he would write her letters imploring her for forgiveness.
You must by all means forgive me for my spontaneous combustion of the mind, sweet and dear little one. Nothing more than a brainstorm predicated upon no substantial facts. I crave you. I would devour you. I care only for you. A human madness. But Imogene wasn't buying it. She was turning against George, and now she had her freedom and the vast majority of his assets. Unwilling to accept his sentence, still believing bribery could bring its swift conclusion, Remus made the worst mistake of his life. Prohibition agent Franklin Dodge put him behind bars, but that wasn't going to stop Remus from trying to convince him to get him out. His plan was to use Imogene's charisma and womanly curves to manipulate Dodge. This plan would backfire spectacularly, as he later learned that both Dodge and his wife had strong motivation to make sure he was locked away for as long as possible. Imogene did as Remus commanded and met with Dodge in a government building in Atlanta. However, she was more interested in securing her release from Remus than her husband's release from prison. The two began a torrid affair. Not long after Imogene's meeting with Dodge, Willie Harr, a fellow bootlegger, warned Remus that his wife was having an affair with the Prohi agent that put him in prison. Remus was in total denial, became red-faced, and threatened to crack Harr's skull, as he had done to the carpet salesman. He had to be restrained by prison guards. Remus became increasingly desperate to shorten his sentence and thought that turning state witness would secure his freedom. He began testifying against other bootleggers and was given special privileges as a result. While testifying in a trial of another bootlegger, Remus and some of his associates, including Harr, stayed at the Lux Robert Fulton Hotel. Most of the men, though they were supposed to be in jail, were allowed to attend shows and roam Atlanta freely. Remus, however, was closely guarded in his hotel room, in disbelief as to why the others were permitted to have a night out on the town and he was not. Harr told Remus that it was Dodge that had him confined to his hotel room because he and Imogene were out on the town and obviously didn't want to be discovered. Instead of trying to crack his skull, Remus deflated in disbelief, telling Harr, "I don't know what she's doing." A witness in the murder trial that would punctuate George and Imogene's marriage would later state that around this time, Imogene said she had the poor boob right where she wanted him. The witness also testified that Imogene put in a call to Dodge, pleading with him to admit his love for her, asking him if he was sure that he loved her, how much he loved her, over and over again. Her nicknames for her lover included Daddy Dodge and Sugar Lump. After she hung up, she told the witness that she was in love with him, and that she gave Remus's diamond tie pin to Dodge. Mabel Walker Willebrandt caught wind that her prized agent was acting in a manner not befitting of a Prohibition agent. She had another agent, Harrington, follow Dodge. In February of 1925, Dodge and Imogene got themselves into a small-scale scandal at the Holiday Inn Hotel in Cleveland. The night watchman of the hotel heard a man and a woman talking to each other. The hotel ledger revealed that a married couple did not rent the room, and co-ed visits were prohibited in the middle of the night. The night watchman pressed his ear against the door and heard more mumbling and the creaking of mattress springs. The hotel employees knocked on the door. Dodge answered with an open fly, an unbuckled belt, and no collar or tie. He claimed that he was in the room with his fiancée, who was sick. The hotel workers said they'd call a doctor, but Dodge insisted it was unnecessary. He was informed that he and Imogene would need to stay in separate rooms, even though Dodge tried to pull rank by telling them he was a government agent. Dodge and Imogene were asked to check out by 7 a.m. and did so at 7:15 the following morning. Dodge paid for both rooms. After mounting evidence of Dodge's corruption, Willebrandt asked for his resignation on August 10, 1925, which he put in the following day. In the late summer of 1925, Remus was halfway through his prison sentence and was about to be transferred back to Ohio to serve time for another charge. Amid all of this, he still believed that Imogene was acting in his best interests, that she was only meeting with Dodge to secure his release from prison. She didn't visit often, but sent letters in bundles of 10 or 12 that were numbered in the order he was meant to read them. This placated him for a time. Shortly before Remus was transferred back to Ohio for the remainder of his sentence, Imogene visited him in Atlanta one more time. They met in the warden's office because the prison was aware that Imogene was often brokering bribes and deals to secure better treatment for her husband, and they wanted to keep an eye on her. Remus yelled at her for leaving Cincinnati and not being easy to reach. He often sent cables to her demanding her to carry out his business affairs, which she didn't always reply to. She told the warden that she was afraid Remus would strike her. Remus eventually calmed down and gave her a diamond ring he bought off another prisoner. The following day, Imogene sent the following letter to Remus. George, after our conversation today, it is very plain that you have lost confidence in me, and as you told me to go ahead and file, I think I will follow your advice. If at any time I can assist you, please let me know. My heart weighs too heavy to say more. The warden, who received the letter before its recipient, noted that Remus never told Imogene to file for divorce during their meeting. Imogene cited extreme cruelty as her reason for ending the marriage. The warden noted that Remus was a very surprised man, but believed that she was being influenced by outside forces. He wrote to her, tried to sound supportive of her decision, but urged her that perhaps she was keeping company with people who did not have her best interests at heart. We know that everlasting clamor for filthy lucre that outside imaginary friends, posing as such for their ulterior gains and benefits, are all the time conspiring, conniving, and scheming to obtain whatever betterment they can for their own personal selfish motives. Remus would later claim that this was the beginning of his mental and emotional decline. In early October, Remus was released from prison briefly after he agreed to turn state's witness against his own estranged wife. Imogene had been implicated in Remus's Jack Daniels scam, where the bootlegger skimmed barrels of whiskey a little at a time and replaced the alcohol with water to throw off the prohies. This happened back in 1922. Imogene had been an investor in this scam and was arrested along with Remus's henchmen in 1924. When Remus returned home to his mansion, the door was padlocked and the windows were locked. He smashed one of them to get in. The mansion was emptied of all of its previous glory and splendor. Imogene got pretty spiteful about it too. She locked the doors and threw away the keys, had spikes driven into the doors to destroy them upon opening. She also either stole or auctioned off the vast majority of his things, including the portrait with George Washington's signature, his prized possession. Other missing valuables included a gold piano, fine bone china, marble statues, crystal chandeliers. The Imogene baths had been stripped bare as well. The artwork and the silver sconces gone. There was still water in the pool, but that was little consolation for Remus, who broke down. Yet, Imogene left one item behind, the pearl-handled pistol. She sold off the majority of Remus's distilleries, and failed to sell them at a profit at that. For one of the properties, Remus paid $197,000. Imogene sold it for $80,000 and sent George his cut, $100. All of these indignities led Remus to counter Imogene's divorce suit, citing misconduct. He named Franklin Dodge in the filing and asked that she be denied alimony. Soon Remus would find out that Imogene didn't need alimony to begin with, because she already absconded with his fortune and was on the run with Dodge. He quickly put one of his associates in charge of his finances and got to work trying to track his riches. Around this time, he fell into a major depression and claimed that he saw a halo made of electrical stars. To compound Remus's misery, a journalist informed George that Imogene and Dodge had put a $15,000 bounty on his head. An anonymous caller gave the journalist the scoop, then swiftly hung up the phone. Remus didn't seem particularly convinced about this conspiracy until a few hours later, when he went to the train station and noticed some goons watching his every move. Remus became red-faced and refused to get on the train. His paranoia increased. He not only blamed Dodge and Imogene, but also accused Willebrandt of being in cahoots with them in the plot against his life. He also accused Willebrandt of being intimate with Dodge. He met with Willebrandt and asked for her help after Imogene left, but the Attorney General was unmoved by Remus's pleas for help. He felt the walls closing in on him, and that no one, especially not the government, was going to help him. The Jack Daniels trial began in Indianapolis in December of 1925. Remus began waiting outside of Dodge and Imogene's hotel in the morning, hoping to stalk them on their way to the courtroom. One morning, Remus confronted Dodge and began beating him with his cane. Dodge's skull wasn't cracked, and he did not press charges, given that the incident would add credence to Remus's infidelity accusations. When Imogene and Remus were reunited in court, Imogene ran away from him in her heels and begged, "Daddy, don't kill me! Don't let him kill me!" Remus commented on what a spectacle Imogene made of herself, which is pretty rich coming from him. Imogene often spoke to the press and once claimed that Remus simultaneously tried to reconcile with her and kill her on the street that same morning. On his way back to his hotel, Remus spotted Dodge in the lobby. He sprang forward. The men with him restrained him,
He was snarling and lashing and writhing. The men managed to pull him back into the elevator. Journalists observed that Remus's neck swelled like a cobra's whenever he spoke of Dodge, and often referred to him as a pimp. The two parties went back and forth accusing each other of hiring hitmen to kill each other. Imogene and Dodge took less violent measures and tried to have Remus deported. While he was locked away in Atlanta, Imogene destroyed all of George's important documents. Nothing ever came of the deportation plot. In July of 1926, Remus reported for his second year-long prison sentence. He would be released in early April the following year. He continued pursuing Dodge and Imogene, as well as his pillaged fortune. He even tried to kill both of them at a boxing match in September of 1927, but arrived just a few minutes after the runaway lovers left. Then, in October of 1927, a man named Harry Truesdale came to visit him at his hotel suite. The two men had never seen each other before. Truesdale told Remus that he was hired by Imogene to kill him, and out of the goodness of his heart, he was warning him. Truesdale met a gangster at a racetrack a few months before. The gangster informed him that if he wanted to make a quick $10,000, he knew of a woman who really wanted to get rid of her husband. The wise guy gave Truesdale the tip because he wanted payback for all the times Remus flipped. Truesdale met with Imogene and was instructed to kill Remus before their divorce trial began in early October. She told him that she would pay him $5,000 and that Franklin Dodge would pay him the other half of the money. After tailing Remus for a few weeks, the would-be assassin and Imogene met up outside of a hotel. Truesdale observed Dodge in a car with several other men. He realized it was a setup, that after he finished the job, he would also be killed to ensure his silence. After that, Truesdale found Remus and told him what he knew. George didn't take the news well. According to Truesdale, "I thought the man would go crazy. He gripped his hands, the perspiration burst out of his forehead, his eyes bulged out, and he run across the room like he was going to jump out of the window." Finally, on the morning of October 6, 1927, Remus arrived at the Hotel Alms at around 7:30 a.m. He was waiting for Imogene to emerge. They were both due in court that day to finalize their divorce. When Imogene exited the hotel, she was wearing a black silk dress and was accompanied by her daughter. Remus was expecting Dodge to be with her instead. The halo and the stars reappeared and directed Remus to do what he did next. According to Remus, at least. Remus had his chauffeur tail Imogene's taxi. Imogene turned around and realized Remus was following her. She ordered the driver to drive fast. Remus's car eventually overtook the taxi, swerving in front of it and blocking it from moving further. They were in Eden Park. Imogene and Remus got out of their respective cars, and Imogene ran as fast as she could through the park, making her way to the Springhouse gazebo. Remus caught up, grabbed her wrists, and twisted her arms so she faced him. She pleaded, "Daddy dear, I love you. Daddy, don't do it." He pointed the gun at her stomach and pulled the trigger. Ruth caught up with the couple and screamed. Imogene ran. Ruth followed after her mother, who began banging on the windows of cars lined up on the street beside the park. She begged to be let in. Most of the drivers took in what happened to her, but didn't let her in the car. Finally, one good Samaritan took Imogene and Ruth into their car and drove them to the hospital. A police officer asked who shot her. She replied, "George Remus." The bullet struck Imogene in her lungs and liver. Doctors knew as soon as they saw her, the wound would be fatal. She died on the operating table at 10:50 that morning. Meanwhile, George walked back through the park into his car, which was gone. His chauffeur booked it from the crime scene. No matter, Remus too hitched a ride with a total stranger and waxed poetic on what a beautiful morning it was in Cincinnati. After George got out of the car, he called a cab and turned himself in to the Cincinnati police and confessed to what he did. He later took them back to Eden Park to find the murder weapon, to no avail. George would later say, "She who dances down the primrose path must die on the primrose path." Several years prior, when he was still a lawyer, George Remus represented a man who killed his wife. The motive for the murder was an affair. The man pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and thanks to Remus's impassioned defense, only served 8 years for his crime, and did not receive the death penalty. As soon as he pulled the trigger, and one could even argue long before, George was sowing the seeds for his own insanity plea. He knew that he was in for the fight for his life, and that he would need to give everything he had into making the jury believe he was insane at the time of the murder. All he had to do was convince 2 jury members that he was insane, and he would be a free man. Remus would become the first person to plead insanity and defend themselves in a murder trial. He did receive help from lawyer Charles Elston in mounting his defense. The trial began on November 21, 1927. The prosecution was represented by Charles Taft, son of 27th President of the United States William Howard Taft. The prosecution's case hinged on the motive that Remus had to kill Imogene before their divorce trial took place. It was there that Imogene planned to reveal some even more sordid details about George, most notably his alleged role in the murder of a sheriff in Indiana during a shootout in 1923. He also believed that Imogene would reveal that George had some secret assets, including part ownership in the Cincinnati Reds. Taft argued that Remus premeditated the murder because he did not subpoena any witnesses to appear on his behalf, implying that he knew there would be no need to do so. If convicted, Remus would face the death penalty. Remus and Elston countered the prosecution's claims by painting Imogene as a scheming, unfaithful wife, whose treachery deteriorated her estranged husband's sanity to the point of one violent outburst. The judge allowed evidence of Imogene's behavior to be admissible in court, and Remus exploited this advantage to the limit. 3 psychologists were called in to analyze Remus's mental state during and after the murder. They asked him why he killed Imogene. Mrs. Remus was a style of woman who should be removed for the betterment of the community. Right after he said this, George quickly changed his answer. He saw Imogene laughing outside of the hotel, and he snapped. This made the crime feel more like one of passion and less planned. The alienists concluded that George was sane at the time of the murder, mainly because he clearly remembered the murder itself. We believe that he is a dangerous psychopath because he is unmoral, lacking a sense of ethics, emotionally unstable, being subject to unrestrained outbreaks of temper and rage, and egocentric to a pathological degree. The judge ruled that the jury was not permitted to see the alienists' report. Remus and Elston called several journalists to the stand to testify. They were invited to take tours of Remus's mansion between 1925 and 1927. Each one testified to witnessing one of Remus's brainstorms, in which he pulled his hair. Not sure how he did this, though, considering he was pretty bald. Maybe it was self-inflicted. His face reddened. He babbled and blathered to himself and wrung his hands. Prosecutors believed these witnesses were following a script and had been invited to the Remus mansion to witness his insanity before he murdered his wife. Clarence Darrow was even called to the stand as a character witness. He testified that George was a law-abiding citizen whose reputation was never questioned back when he was an attorney in Chicago. Though Remus was often jovial during the trial, laughing and smiling and winking at the jury, he would have another so-called brainstorm when Harry Truesdale was called to testify. Truesdale recounted the story of how Imogene and Dodge paid him to have Remus killed. George erupted into uncontrollable sobs and turned on his weeping pleading act. He was so distraught that he asked the court to be adjourned for the day, a request the judge granted. Back in his cell, after he calmed down, a reporter came to visit Remus. George asked him, "How am I doing, kid?" In mid-December, Taft and Remus made their final arguments to the jury. Remus wore a gray silk suit instead of black, and a sprig of holly in his lapel. He referred to Imogene's murder as the unfortunate death of the deceased, as if she died of natural causes. Taft once again reiterated what he believed to be Remus's motivation for the murder, while Remus made several allusions to Imogene's complicity in his crimes, each of which were objected to by the prosecution. To the end, he was steadfast in his story that he was mentally unstable at the time of the murder. As to how the act was committed, how the thing happened, how the homicide was committed, he doesn't know, and never will know of his 5 senses, claimed Remus. The jury deliberated for 19 minutes. Well, actually about half that, they took a lunch break before returning their verdict. Due to a combination of Remus's immigrant working-class appeal, the growing weariness with Prohibition, and the efforts to put the victim rather than the perpetrator on trial, Remus was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Some of the jurors later commented, "I believe Remus was justified in what he did. We felt that Remus had been greatly wrong, and that he had suffered almost beyond human endurance." When the verdict was read, there was a brief but deafening silence, then an eruption of applause. Remus was over the moon. This is American justice. Taft commented that the verdict was a miscarriage of justice, and that Remus was acquitted by the newspapers. Remus posed for photos with the jurors outside of the courtroom. As soon as he proved his insanity, Remus then flipped the script and focused on proving his sanity. The insanity verdict meant that he wouldn't be immediately freed, but confined to a mental hospital until he was proved sane. In January of 1928, Remus was transferred to Lima State Hospital, which he referred to as a dumping ground of humanity. By March of that year, Remus, proving his mental stability, was released, despite the efforts of Taft to prevent this outcome. George Remus was a free man again. Remus may have been acquitted in the court of law, but the court of public opinion swiftly turned on him. An editorial wondered, are people justified in believing they might be better off if they broke the law and were made heroes? When Remus was released from the mental hospital, his main objective was to track down his stolen riches. He did not keep invoices or records of his financial transaction during his bootlegging heyday, since we know that criminals are generally not fans of paper trails. However, this backfired on him when it came to recovering his money. Since he could not prove it was his to begin with, he failed to get it back. Even the safety deposit boxes Imogene opened were worthless. Most of them only contained bottles of booze. He did, however, recover his lost portrait with George Washington's signature. Remus decided to let bygones be bygones with Dodge and did not pursue him after his release. I guess he was smart enough to know that lightning doesn't strike twice, and that if he got himself in trouble again, he would surely face the consequences. The same applied to the bootlegging business. Remus left it all behind, despite there being a few years of prohibition left. His numerous arrests and high-profile murder trial had done a great deal of damage to his reputation, even amongst fellow criminals. A new generation had risen to power, one more ruthless and violent than the previous one. The macho mafiosos felt that Remus lacked honor in killing a woman. They believed that the chivalrous thing to do was to kill Dodge. Plus, Remus had flipped so many times that if he dared go back into the whiskey business, he would surely be whacked. It may be that the only thing that prevented other gangsters from killing Remus was the bad publicity it would attract. Ever the tactician, Remus walked away and became something of a criminal consultant, mentoring would-be gangsters looking to get their start in the criminal underworld. As for Dodge, Willebrandt was adamant that he not face any legal consequences for his corruption. She felt that Prohibition could not take any more bad press, and given that Dodge was her protege, her reputation would suffer immensely if he was put on trial. J. Edgar Hoover disagreed. Though Willebrandt outranked him, he still managed to put Dodge behind bars for perjury in the trial of another bootlegger in 1923. Dodge went to jail for 30 months in 1930. He lived out the rest of his life in his hometown of Lansing, Michigan, and died in 1968. After her mother's murder, Ruth changed her last name from Remus back to Holmes, her biological father's name. During the trial, she testified about Remus's abuse, and was stunned at his lack of feeling, especially when her mother's blood-stained dress was shown in court. She died in 1948 after a botched hysterectomy. Remus married his secretary in 1930. He sold the Price Hill Mansion in 1934. The home was demolished, but the memory of New Year's 1922 lives on. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1952. According to The Bourbon King by Bob Batchelor, at the height of his power, Remus's personal wealth would have ranged between $307 and $384 million. I know Remus was a bad dude, but I think we'd all be weeping and pleading if we lost that amount of money too. Ultimately, this is a story where all parties involved behaved abhorrently, but only Imogene was punished. Remus played the jury, the judge, the prosecution, the press, and the public like a fiddle. He consistently blamed Imogene for her fate, referring to her murder as a very pitiful, sorrowful incident happening to her, and used her association with Dodge as justification for her murder. Oh, I feel sorry to think she was unfortunate, that she would be tied up with that kind of human parasite. Years after his death, his tombstone, which features 2 angel statues, was vandalized. The wings were destroyed. Legend has it that the culprit felt Remus was not fit to be guarded by angels. Although The Great Gatsby was published 2 years before Imogene's death, one can't help but see the many parallels between Fitzgerald's novel and the real lives of the Remuses. And it's not just that Remus was a bootlegger who liked luxury and threw insane parties. His tale, as well as Gatsby's, is one of a rise and a fall, of glamour and corruption, of obsession ending in bloodshed. It's no coincidence that upon George's death, a newspaper headline read, "Another Gatsby passes." The legend of George and Imogene persists. Some believe the pearl pistol wasn't the only thing left behind in Eden Park. It is said that the spirit of Imogene still haunts the gazebo and can be heard weeping and pleading, running for her life, then disappearing into the mist. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and join me next time as we examine another affair from history.